The sun hit the earth like fire. Heat shimmered off the sand, turning the land into a furnace that swallowed sound and mercy alike. Elias Ward pulled his wagon to a stop beside a half-buried well, nothing but splintered wood and a rope that hadn't carried water in years. The horses were panting, and so was the girl in the back. She tried to climb down, but her knees buckled. Dust clung to her lips as she whispered, hoarse and trembling, "You've paid for me. Just do it." Elias froze. The words struck like a whip across the silence. Her wrists were bound, her skin raw and sunburned. The wind tugged at her hair, hiding her face, but not her shame. He had seen men die in the desert, seen horses shot, seen the worst kind of mercy, but he had never seen someone ask for death like this. He took a slow step forward. "No one's gonna hurt you," he said quietly, though even he didn't sound convinced. The girl's shoulders shook. Her eyes pale, fevered met his for the first time. Elias untied her wrists, poured the last of his water into her cupped hands. She drank, trembling, the dirt washing off her lips, like sin leaving a soul. Behind them, the canyon wind howled through the dry mesquite, carrying the weight of all that was broken. Elias looked toward the horizon, his ranch somewhere beyond the dust, and muttered, almost to himself, "God help me. What kind of man buys a life to save it?" The wagon creaked through the desert, each turn of the wheel echoing like a heartbeat too slow to live. The girl lay in the back, wrapped in Elias's old coat, too large for her, too heavy for someone who barely weighed more than her own fear. The sky above them was white and cruel. Ravens circled somewhere far away, waiting for things to end, as they always did out here. Elias kept his eyes on the trail, reins firm in his hands. He didn't speak. There were no words that wouldn't sound like guilt. The sound of the wheels against the hard-pan dirt was their only company. At times, he could hear her breathing shallow, uneven, like a fire trying to stay alive in the wind. He thought of offering her more water, but the canteen was nearly dry. And what if she didn't want saving? By dusk, the horizon began to shift. The flat emptiness gave way to the red walls of Pecos Ridge, the land folding into quiet canyons where grass still remembered rain. That was home's Silver Mesa Ranch, a place built from sweat and solitude, where silence had become safer than prayer. He glanced back. She was awake now, staring at the fading Sunday. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Maybe a name, maybe a memory. When the wagon rolled to a stop by the fence, Elias climbed down and reached for her hand. She flinched before he even touched her. "I won't hurt you," he said softly. "Not here." Her eyes met his for the first time without fear, only exhaustion, so deep it looked holy. She nodded once, barely. That night, as he built a small fire beside the barn, Elias caught himself looking at the well again, the same kind of well she'd almost died beside, and thought, maybe that's where redemption starts, with water, and a lie you wish were true. Morning came pale and brittle. The wind slid through the broken shutters of the cabin, carrying with it the smell of dust and cold ashes. Clara stirred beneath the coarse blanket, her body aching in places she didn't know could ache. For a moment she forgot where she was, the silence almost too kind, too foreign. Then she saw the wooden beams, the tin cup beside her bed, and the folded coat that smelled faintly of smoke and horse. She sat up slowly, eyes darting to the open door. Through it, she saw Elias Ward in the yard, feeding the horses, his movements calm, deliberate. He talked to them in a low murmur, as if they understood every word. A pot sat on the stove, steam curling up like a prayer. The smell of coffee filled the small cabin, bitter, grounding, real. Then his voice came from outside, steady but distant. "There's coffee if you want some." No command, no price, just words hanging in the morning air. Clara hesitated. Her fingers traced the cup, the way one might test the edge of a blade. She half expected a trap. Kindness had never come without a cost. Still, she rose, bare feet meeting the cool dirt floor, and stepped outside. Elias didn't turn. He poured a second cup, set it on the railing, then went back to tightening the saddle straps. The sun was softer now, painting the canyon in gold instead of fire. Clara reached for the cup, her hands still trembling. She took a sip. The warmth burned her tongue, but it felt alive. Elias finally looked up. Their eyes met not as captor and captive, but as two people haunted by different ghosts. "You can stay here," he said, voice quiet, rough as gravel, "till you figure out what's next." Clara stared at him, unable to speak. She didn't believe him yet, but for the first time in months, she wanted to. By the fifth morning, the air had changed. The same wind still carried dust from the canyon, but it wasn't cruel anymore, it simply was. Clara woke to the sound of hammering. Elias was by the fence line, sleeves rolled up, driving nails into new boards. His shirt clung to his back, soaked with sweat and sunlight. "Bring me the rope," he said without looking up. She hesitated, then obeyed, careful not to trip on the uneven ground. When she handed it to him, their fingers brushed just a second, but it was enough to send a ripple through both. Elias cleared his throat. "You ever tie a knot that holds?" She shook her head. "Then today's the day you learn." He showed her how. Loop, pull, tighten. His hands were rough, but steady. When she tried to copy him, the rope slipped, not unraveling into dust. He grunted, half amused, half tired. "Looks like the mule tied it better." It wasn't much of a joke, but Clara blinked at him, unsure whether to frown or smile. When he lifted one brow, deadpan, she laughed. Not loud, not forced, a real laugh. The first since she could remember. The sound startled even her. It echoed across the fence and bounced off the hills like something alive returning home. Elias didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched, and his voice softened. "Now, that's better." For the rest of the day, they worked side by side. She learned to tie, to lift, to breathe again. And when the sun sank, the ranch looked a little less like a prison and a little more like a place that might one day hold peace. That night, they shared a simple meal by the fire. Clara told him about a river she used to visit as a child, how it sang when the wind passed. Elias listened, quiet, eyes lowered, as if memorizing the sound of her voice. When she fell silent, he finally said, "Maybe you'll find that river again." Clara looked at the firelight dancing across his face, at the faint curve of his lips, and thought, maybe I already have. The days fell into a rhythm, if you could call silence a rhythm. Every morning, the sun climbed slow over Pecos Ridge, and the dust lifted like ghosts from the earth. Elias Ward rose before dawn, tended the horses, checked the fences. Clara watched him through the small cabin window, her hands folded on her lap, afraid of doing wrong, afraid of doing nothing. He didn't speak much. The few times he did, it was always simple, practical. "Hold the gate. Watch the rope. That one bites." No softness, no threat, just words that fit the work. And maybe that was mercy enough. Clara tried to help where she could. She carried buckets of water, stacked wood by the porch, swept the cabin floor. But she was clumsy, and once she dropped a pail, spilling half the water they had left. She froze, expecting his anger, the kind she'd seen in men's eyes before. Elias only looked at her, quiet for a long moment, then said, "Try again." The words were small, but they landed heavy. She did. That night, after supper, they sat apart, Elias by the fire, sharpening an old knife. Clara mending the torn sleeve of her dress with thread she'd found in a drawer. The crackle of wood filled the space between them, steady as breath. Outside, coyotes howled across the canyon, the sound thin and lonely. Clara glanced up. "Do they ever stop?" she asked softly. Elias didn't look away from the blade. "No. Some things out here just cry to remind the world they're still alive." She thought about that for a long time. Maybe that's what she was doing too, surviving by sound, by silence, by the weight of her own heartbeat. When she finally went to bed, she heard Elias step outside, the door closing gentle behind him. Through the window, she saw him standing under the moonlight, hat in hand, staring into nothing. For a moment, he looked like a man carved from the same dust as the desert, unbreakable, but lonely beyond words. And that was when she realized he wasn't saving her. He was saving himself, one quiet day at a time. The day began like any other, heat rising early, wind already restless across the Pecos Ridge. By mid-afternoon, the air shimmered above the dirt like a veil of fire. Elias Ward had been repairing the east fence since sunrise, hammering new planks into posts so old they'd turned silver in the Sunday sweat ran down his neck, stinging the scar that cut across his shoulder. Not far away, Clara worked by the well, drawing up water for the horses. She wore one of Elias's old shirts too big, sleeves rolled high, him tied at her waist. Her hands were cracked, her face burned, but there was a steadiness in the way she moved now. She had learned the rhythm of this place, the sound of the wind through the fence wire, the creak of the barn door, the hush that came before evening. For weeks, peace had been a fragile thing here, held together by silence and the daily mercy of routine. But peace in the West never lasted long. The horses felt it first. 3 of them lifted their heads in unison, ears twitching toward the horizon, their bodies stiffened, nostrils flaring. A moment later, the air itself seemed to pause. Elias looked up, squinting into the Sunday. At first, he saw nothing but the endless wave of heat rolling off the sand. Then, faintly, came the low thrum of hooves, distant, deliberate, like thunder pretending to be far away. His chest tightened. He set the hammer down slowly. "Clara," he called, voice low but firm. She turned, a loose strand of hair sticking to her cheek. "What is it?" "Inside. Now." Something in his tone made her drop the bucket. Water spilled across her boots, turning the dirt into a small patch of mud. Then she heard it too. The sound was unmistakable now. 3 horses, maybe 4, coming fast. Dust rose behind them like smoke from a fire. Clara's stomach turned cold. She didn't need to see their faces. She already knew. Her breath hitched. "It's them." Elias's eyes darkened. "Get behind the barn. Don't move until I tell you." She hesitated, fear freezing her feet in place. "You can't. Now, Clara." The edge in his voice cut through the air. She ran. Elias crossed the yard, unhurried but certain, and opened the barn door. The rifle hung on the wall where it always did, his father's old Winchester 1873, the wood worn smooth from years of use. He loaded it with practiced ease. The metal clicked, clean and final. By the time he stepped back into the sunlight, the riders had reached the ridge. 3 of them, faces hidden under wide-brimmed hats and scarves. Their horses were lean, mean-looking things, the kind that had seen too many long nights and worse men. They slowed as they approached the ranch gate. The man in front, tall, with a scar down his cheek, grinned like a wolf. "Afternoon, Ward. Fine day for settlin' old business." Elias said nothing. He planted his boots in the dirt and rested the rifle across his arm. The second man spat. "We've come for what's ours." Elias's voice was even quiet. "You got the wrong place." "Oh, I don't think so," the leader drawled. "Word in Dodge says you bought yourself a girl at the auction. Pretty little thing. We were the ones who caught her first. Means she's marked property, far as we see it." Clara, hidden behind the barn wall, pressed her hand to her mouth to stop a sound. Elias's jaw flexed. He tilted his head slightly. "That what you call it? Property?" The man's grin widened. "Don't act holy, Ward. You paid for her same as anyone else. $40, wasn't it? Hell, we should thank you for keeping her in one piece." The rifle came up so fast the man's smile died before he realized it. "Say another word," Elias said, voice low as thunder, "and you won't finish it." The riders stiffened. The third man's hand hovered near his belt. Elias's finger brushed the trigger. For a moment, no one breathed. The world narrowed to the space between them, dust, heat, and the faint rattle of the windmill behind the house. The leader shifted in his saddle, eyes narrowing. "You won't shoot, not unless you're ready to bury us all." Elias didn't blink. "I've buried worse." Something in his tone, flat, certain, made even the horses fidget. They'd all heard the stories. Elias Ward, the quiet veteran from Abilene who took down 4 rustlers in one stormy night, never firing more than once per man. The outlaw spat into the dirt, mask slipping from confidence to caution. "You think one man can stop what's coming?" Elias stepped closer, boots steady. "Don't need to stop it, just need to slow it long enough for you to remember what fear feels like." The wind gusted then, carrying the smell of rain and iron. For a long beat, nobody moved. Then, reluctantly, the leader pulled on his reins. "This ain't over," he said. "We'll be back when the law ain't looking. Then I'll still be here." Elias replied. They turned their horses and rode off, the dust swallowing them whole. Elias stood still until the last echo of hooves vanished over the ridge. Then, only then, did he lower the rifle. His hands were steady, but his heartbeat thundered in his ears. From behind the barn, Clara stepped out slowly, eyes wide. "They'll come back," she whispered. He nodded. "I know." Her voice cracked. "They'll kill you, Elias. They'll—" He shook his head. "Not if I end this first." She stared at him, the wind tugging her hair across her face. "You can't fight the whole world." Elias looked past her toward the horizon, the same horizon he'd crossed years ago, chasing wars, ghosts, and now redemption. "Don't have to," he said. "Just the part of it that keeps people like you afraid." He started back toward the porch, but she grabbed his sleeve. "Why do you care what happens to me?" He stopped, eyes on the dirt. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then quietly, "Because once, I didn't, and I've been paying for it ever since." Clara's hand slipped from his arm. The truth in his voice scared her more than the men had. She watched as he set the rifle beside the door, then sat on the step, staring into the darkening sky. The first thunder cracked across the ridge. Lightning split the clouds, painting the ranch in flashes of silver. Rain began to fall slow, heavy drops that hit the ground like forgiveness. Clara stood in the doorway, watching him. "What will you do?" Elias didn't look up. "Whatever it takes to make this right." She wanted to argue, but something in his eyes told her he'd already made peace with whatever came next. When she finally went inside, he remained outside in the rain, the lantern burning beside him. The rifle lay across his knees again, his hands resting on it gently, almost reverently, not as a weapon, but as a promise. Lightning flashed once more, and for an instant, Elias Ward looked less like a man and more like a monument carved from dust and regret, standing between a woman's fragile peace and the chaos that had always ruled the West. And somewhere in the distance, the thunder rolled on not as a warning this time, but as an answer. Tomorrow would bring a reckoning. But tonight, in the hush between storms, there was only resolve and the faint, unspoken hope that redemption might still be possible beneath the shadows on the horizon. Night fell heavy over Silver Mesa Ranch. The storm had passed, but the air still carried that wet smell, rain, dirt, and something older. Something like fear. Elias Ward sat on the porch, rifle across his knees, lantern light cutting half his face into shadow. His shirt was damp, sleeves rolled, veins raised along his arms from holding the gun too long. He hadn't spoken since the riders left. The only sound was the wind and the slow rhythm of his breath, measured, controlled, like a man trying not to think too loud. Inside the cabin, Clara couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw them again, the smirks, the rope burns, the dust swirling around that auction block in Red Bluff. She rose quietly, wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, and stepped outside. He didn't look at her, but he knew she was there. "You should rest." "I can't." Elias nodded slightly, eyes fixed on the horizon. The night stretched endless, stars sharp as nails. "They'll come back," she said softly. "You know they will." He sighed, setting the rifle down beside him. "Yeah, men like that always do." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Clara asked the question that had been burning since that day at the well. "Why did you buy me?" The words fell like stones. Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees, rubbing the scar that ran down his forearm, the one he never explained. "Because someone had to," he said finally. "That's not an answer." He looked up then, and there was something raw in his eyes, older than guilt, older than grief. "Years ago, I was in Abilene. There was a raid. Bunch of settlers taking women, kids. We got there too late. There was one girl, looked about your age. She begged me to help. I didn't. I told myself it wasn't my fight." He paused, voice tightening. "Next morning, we found her body near the creek." Clara's breath caught. The wind stirred the fire between them. Elias continued, quieter. "Ever since that day, I see her face every time I close my eyes. So when I saw you on that stage in Red Bluff," he shook his head. "Maybe I thought I could buy my way out of hell." Silence again, but this time it was full. Clara stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the wood. She sat beside him, the blanket brushing his arm. "You can't pay for something like that," she whispered. "I know," he said, "but maybe I can earn it." He reached for the rifle, checked the chamber. The steel clicked a sound too calm for what it meant. "I'll ride to Fort Stockton tomorrow. Talk to Sheriff Hawkins." Clara frowned. "The law won't help people like me." "Then it'll help people like me," Elias said. "Those men think they own the world, but there's a paper with their mark on it, the same one they used to sell you. That's all I need." She wanted to stop him, to say the desert didn't forgive men who chased justice, but his eyes had that steady look again, the look of a soldier who'd already buried too many ghosts. When dawn came, the world was washed clean or pretending to be. The sky stretched wide and pink over the canyon. Elias saddled his horse, checked his rifle, and tied the folded bill of sale inside his coat pocket. Clara stood in the doorway, clutching the blanket. "You don't owe me this," she said. Elias looked at her for a long time, then answered, "Maybe not, but maybe I owe it to the next man who'll find a reason to look away." He mounted the horse. The sound of hooves echoed down the empty trail, fading into the morning stillness. Clara watched until he disappeared into the haze. Then she turned to the horizon, whispered into the wind, "Come back to me." The wind carried her words into the canyons, across the dry riverbeds, toward the man who rode alone between guilt and redemption. And somewhere in that endless stretch of desert, Elias Ward whispered a prayer of his own, not for mercy, but for meaning. "God, if there's any law left in this land, let it be the kind that saves more than it punishes." The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows that reached toward Fort Stockton, where the law of the West waited, blunt and uncertain. But for the first time in years, Elias rode not to escape his past. He rode through it. The road to Fort Stockton was long and merciless. Dust rose behind Elias Ward's horse in slow, tired spirals. The land stretched out like an ocean of heat, endless, shimmering, and empty enough to swallow a man's thoughts whole. He didn't stop, not once. The canteen hung dry before noon, but he kept riding. Every hoofbeat felt like the tick of a clock he'd been running from for years. When the wooden walls of the fort finally appeared in the distance, the sun was already bleeding into the horizon. Soldiers' voices drifted from the yard, mingling with the clang of hammers and the restless whinny of horses. Elias dismounted, tied the reins, and walked straight toward the small sheriff's office near the flagpole. Inside, the smell of tobacco and old leather hit him like memory. Sheriff Hawkins sat behind the desk, hat tilted low, boots crossed, the same man who once led Elias through the last year of the war. When he looked up, his face softened with recognition. "Well, I'll be damned. Elias Ward. I thought you'd turned to dust by now." "Not yet," Elias said, placing his hat on the counter. "Need your help." Hawkins leaned back, eyes narrowing. "You don't sound like a man looking for favors." Elias reached into his coat, pulled out the folded paper, the bill of sale. He laid it on the desk like a weapon. The sheriff stared, frowning, then unfolded it carefully. The ink was smeared, but the name still burned clear. "Clara Hensley. Bought her," Elias said. "Red Bluff auction. $40. Hawkins's brows knit together. "Hell, Elias, that's a human sale. You telling me you?" "I'm telling you I bought her to stop it." His voice cut through the room. "Those bastards were selling people like cattle. I had to make it stop, if only for one." The sheriff studied him, searching for cracks in his face. "And you're here now because?" Elias looked down at the floorboards. "Because the men who sold her came back. They'll keep coming, unless someone calls it what it is, a crime." He nodded toward the paper. "Their mark's right there, the same one they've used before. Check your records, I know you've seen it." Hawkins turned the page over. Burned into the edge was a small brand, half circle, with across the mark of Clayton Voss, a name that had surfaced too many times in too many bad reports. The sheriff exhaled, low. "You're right. Voss has been running a trade out of Abilene, using fake freight ledgers to hide people in with the livestock." He rose, walked to the cabinet, pulled out a stack of wanted sheets. 3 men, Voss, Danner, Reeve, all tied to it. Elias's jaw tightened. "They're the ones who came to my ranch." For a long moment, Hawkins said nothing. The only sound was the crackle of the oil lamp and the distant murmur of soldiers outside. Then the sheriff poured 2 glasses of whiskey and slid one across the table. Been a while since we fought the same war, huh? Elias didn't take the drink. Some wars never end. Hawkins nodded. You got proof. That's more than most ever bring. I'll send 2 rangers with you by dawn. Elias hesitated. I don't want blood. Out there, the sheriff said. Law don't always care what you want, but it'll care what you can prove. The words lingered. The law of the West blunt, simple, and too often late. Still, it was all they had. When morning came, Elias rode out with 2 Texas Rangers, their badges glinting under the pale sky. They followed the faint tracks leading down through Dry Creek Canyon, where the 3 outlaws had camped the night before. By midday, smoke rose from a narrow ravine. The Rangers dismounted quietly, rifles ready. Elias moved ahead, silent as the dust. He spotted the men near a dying campfire, their laughter echoing through the rocks. It ended quickly. 1 warning shot cracked through the canyon. 2 of the men dropped their guns instantly. The third reached for his belt, and Elias fired once clean, deliberate, final. When the smoke cleared, the Rangers tied their hands, read them their charges. Hawkins's voice echoed in Elias's head. Law don't care what you want, only what you can prove. He had proven enough. By the time they returned to Fort Stockton, the sun was low again, hanging heavy over the fort walls. Hawkins waited by the gate, a paper already in his hand, the same bill of sale, now stamped in red ink with 1 word. Void. He handed it to Elias. You did right, old friend. Elias looked at the stamp, then at the sheriff. Maybe, but right don't fix broken things. The sheriff nodded slowly. No, but it keeps worse things from breaking too. Elias mounted his horse, pocketed the paper, and turned toward the road home. The horizon glowed gold, stretching endless and quiet. Behind him, Fort Stockton faded into the dust, a small symbol of law in a world too wide for rules. Ahead waited Silver Mesa, and a girl who still didn't believe she was free. As he rode into the setting sun, the paper in his pocket rustled W. The sun was falling low over Pecos Ridge when Elias Ward finally saw the shape of his ranch again, that crooked fence line, the leaning windmill, the small cabin standing against the endless red sky. He had ridden for nearly 2 days without rest. Dust covered his face, his coat, his soul. But the paper in his pocket was still there, folded neat, stamped in red ink. Void. He dismounted slowly, every muscle stiff from the road. The horses in the corral lifted their heads at his scent. From the cabin came the faint creak of wood, someone moving inside. Clara stepped into the doorway. The light behind her made her hair glow like fire through smoke. For a moment, she didn't move. Her hands were clasped tight in front of her, as if bracing for bad news. You came back, she said, voice trembling. I said I would. She looked at the rifle slung over his shoulder, the dust on his boots, the weight in his eyes. Did you find them? He nodded. They won't come again. Something flickered across her face, not relief, not yet, but a cautious disbelief. The law helped you? For once, he murmured. He reached into his coat and unfolded the paper. And it helped you too. Clara hesitated before stepping closer. Elias handed her the sheet with both hands, like an offering. The sheriff's stamp glowed faintly in the fading light. Across the top, in thick letters, it read, Certificate of Freedom. She stared at it, lips parted, unable to breathe. The paper shook between her fingers. Then, softly, she whispered, I was never just a thing to you, was I? Elias looked at her, really looked the way a man studies the land he spent half his life fighting to keep. His voice came low, gravelly, stripped bare of everything but truth. Never was. The words hung in the air, heavy and simple, and something inside her broke, not in pain this time, but release. She pressed the paper to her chest, tears spilling down her cheeks, silent as rain. Elias turned away, walking toward the fence, giving her that privacy. The wind brushed through the dry grass, carrying the faint sound of her sobs and the rustle of the paper freedom whispering through the dust. When she finally spoke again, her voice was steadier. What happens now? He leaned against the post, eyes on the horizon. Now you get to choose. Clara stepped beside him, holding the paper tightly. And you? Elias smiled faintly, the kind of smile that barely reached his eyes. I've made my choices. Now I'll live with them. They stood there in silence as the last light bled over the canyon. The sky turned gold, then amber, then a deep blue that swallowed everything. Clara's fingers brushed the back of his hand hesitant, but she didn't pull away. Neither did he. Behind them, the cabin windows glowed with the light of the fire she had lit. For the first time, that house didn't feel haunted. Thank you, she whispered. Elias shook his head. Don't thank me. Just live. When night settled, the two of them sat on the porch, drinking coffee from the same tin cups. The coyotes sang somewhere in the distance, their cries rising and falling like a hymn for the lost. Elias watched the stars appear one by one, his thumb tracing the rim of his cup. He thought of the girl by the well, the one who had begged for death, and the woman now sitting beside him, holding freedom in her hands. Maybe some things really could be mended. When Clara finally leaned her head against his shoulder, just for a moment, Elias didn't move. He let the silence speak. The land breathed again. And in that still night, under the vast American sky, neither of them felt owned by the past anymore. Morning came soft over Silver Mesa Ranch. The storm had passed, leaving the air clear and sweet with the scent of wet dust and mesquite. Sunlight crept through the clouds in slow golden streaks, resting on the fences Elias had mended, on the barn doors that still bore the scars of years alone. Elias Ward sat on the porch, boots muddy, cup of coffee steaming between his hands. He hadn't slept much, but for once the fatigue felt earned. Every muscle ached, yet something inside him, something quiet, was finally still. From inside the cabin came the faint clatter of tin cups. Clara was awake. She stepped out barefoot, hair loose over her shoulders, carrying 2 mugs. Her hands trembled, just a little, but her eyes, they were different. No longer hollow, no longer bracing for pain. There was calm there now, a soft, determined kind of calm. She handed him a cup and smiled faintly. Feels quiet today. Elias nodded. Quiet can be good. They drank in silence, watching the light move across the ridge. The earth steamed under the sun, the smell of rain mixing with coffee and wood smoke. For a long time neither spoke, and they didn't need to. The silence that once divided them had turned into something shared, something living. After a while, Clara set her cup down. I used to hate mornings, she said. They meant another day I had to survive. Elias looked at her, waiting. But this morning, she continued softly, it feels like it's waiting for me, not against me. Elias's throat tightened. He wanted to answer, to say something kind, something simple, but words always felt too small in his mouth. Instead, he just nodded. You'll do fine, he said at last. Better than most. Clara smiled, that quiet kind of smile that held more truth than laughter ever could. You sound sure. I am. The breeze stirred, lifting a strand of her hair. She tucked it behind her ear, then looked toward the open land beyond the fence. I've been thinking, she said, about San Angelo. There's a small church school there. I could learn to read, maybe help teach one day. Elias set his cup down. That's a long ride. I know, but you want to go? Yes, she said, voice steady. I want to start something that's mine. He looked at her for a long moment. Pride and fear wrestled quietly behind his eyes. Then I'll help you saddle a horse. She blinked, surprised. You won't try to stop me? He almost smiled. Wouldn't do any good if I did. They stood together in the yard, the land glittering with dew. Elias fetched his best mare, brushed her down, tightened the saddle. Clara packed what little she owned, the folded blanket, a loaf of bread, and the paper-stamped certificate of freedom. When the horse was ready, he offered his hand to help her mount. For a heartbeat, they stayed like that, his rough fingers against hers, both of them remembering everything that had passed between them without needing to say it. When she sat in the saddle, the wind caught her dress, lifting it gently around her knees. The horizon ahead glowed gold. Thank you, she said, her voice trembling. Elias shook his head. Don't thank me. Just live well enough that it matters. Clara hesitated, then leaned down slightly. You could come with me. He looked away toward the ridge, where sunlight spilled like molten brass. No, he said quietly. This land still needs mending. Her eyes softened. Maybe we both do. He didn't answer. He only stepped back, hat in hand, and nodded once. Clara turned her horse toward the trail. For a moment, neither moved, two silhouettes in the golden light, bound by something that wasn't love yet, but something just as sacred. When she finally rode off, the wind carried her hair and her laughter into the hills. Elias watched until she vanished behind the ridge. The world felt empty again, but not hollow. The silence was alive like the pause between heartbeats. He walked back to the well, the same one where despair had once spoken its final words. Water shimmered at the bottom, clear from the rain. He lowered the bucket, filled it, and drank deeply. The taste was cold and clean. It tasted like grace. Elias looked toward the open land, his voice barely a whisper. She's free now. Maybe I am too. The wind answered with nothing but peace. And as the sun climbed higher, Silver Mesa Ranch glowed under a new light, the kind that didn't burn, but healed. The evening wind swept across Silver Mesa Ranch, gentle now, not cruel like before. Elias Ward stood by the well he had rebuilt with his own hands, the rope clean, the stone shining with the last light of the Sunday. He filled the bucket, watching the water ripple like glass. Somewhere beyond the ridge, Clara was riding toward a new life, toward San Angelo, where her name would be her own again. She had left behind a note on the table, its words simple: "Thank you for giving me back what the world took." Elias folded the paper carefully, placed it over his heart, and whispered, "You lived, girl. That's all that ever mattered." The desert was quiet except for the wind and the sound of the well, dripping slow, steady, alive like hope finding its way back. He looked toward the horizon and smiled, faint but real. Maybe some things can be saved after all. If this story touched you, take a breath, pour yourself a cup of tea, and share it with someone who still believes in kindness. Don't forget to subscribe for more Wild West love stories, tales of redemption, love, and the quiet courage that still rides under the same Sunday.